Thank you all. I'm Ron Collins, and it's a pleasure to be participating in introducing folks for tonight's program. Just before I introduce our two speakers, a word of thanks to Katie and all the fine folks at the Knight Institute. I remember many, many years ago being at a party and meeting this man named Jamil Jaffer, and he had this idea, and that idea has turned into an incredible institute, the Knight Institute, and all the fine work they do. So it's a great honor to have them co-present this with us, and we look forward to future opportunities. If you turn the clock back in time to 1972, 73 Supreme Court term, a woman named Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued a case called Frontiero versus Richardson before the court. That same term, Lemon versus Kurtzman was decided. Paris Adult Theater versus Slatton was decided. San Antonio versus Rodriguez was decided. And yes, Roe versus Wade was decided. Why am I telling you all of that? Well, because there were two young men, then young men, who served as law clerks. One is to the Chief Justice, and the other to, that's Chief Justice Berger, and the other to Associate Justice William Brennan. Let me start off by the former law clerk to Chief Justice Berger, Lee Carroll Bollinger. Lee, what a delight it is to see you again, and we're delighted to have you participate in this program. As many know, Lee is the president of Columbia University. He's held that position for 2 decades, the longest president in Ivy League history. He is also the Seth Lowe Professor of Law at the law school. And during his presidency, he took the lead role in a very important case, Gritter versus Bollinger, successfully, I should add. And Lee has authored or edited several books on free speech. And we're so delighted to have you with us tonight, Lee. Welcome. Let me next introduce someone who served as his colleague as a law clerk at the Supreme Court, then, as I said, to Associate Justice William Brennan, and that's my friend Geoffrey Stone, who also clerked for Skelly Wright on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Jeff is the Edward Levy Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He's the former provost of the University of Chicago. He's the editor of the Supreme Court Review. He's the co-editor of one of the leading constitutional law casebooks. And like Lee, he is the author or editor of several books on free speech law. Finally, the incredible duo of Bollinger and Stone have books forthcoming on social media and free speech, a book on Roe v. Wade, and a book on affirmative action. Gentlemen, welcome. I now am happy to turn the floor over to Ellen. Ellen, welcome.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Time to teach, writing all those books. Really shame. So the book you wrote, National Security, Leaks, and Freedom of the Press, is actually a series of essays published last year, 50 years after the historic Supreme Court ruling in the Pentagon Papers case. This gives us the opportunity to both look back at the ruling, explore its ramifications, and then pull forward to the present to explore gaps the ruling did not address and challenges arising from technology and the way information is gathered and analyzed. So why don't I start by asking you, one or both, to outline the main theme or themes of the essay and what inspired you to tackle this subject at this time. And if you would, as you lay this out, explain briefly what the court held in the Pentagon Papers and why that was historic, but how it addressed only one aspect of press freedom. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jeff.
So Lee and I decided to put this book together in part because it was the 50th anniversary of the court's decision in the Pentagon Papers case, and also because given changes in the state of the world over that half century, there were many important questions about whether the Pentagon Papers decision and other decisions that came later made sense in the changing world. Some of those changes, just to mention them, were a vast expansion in the size of the national security community within the government, which made keeping things secret much more challenging. Changes in the media The advent of social media vastly expanded the potential risks of publication of national security information. And it was obviously a moment, it continues to be a moment, in which there is uncertainty and tension about how to handle the issues of leaks and the rights of reporters and who is a journalist. And so we brought together a group of scholars from the legal world, including people like Cass Sunstein, David Strauss, Jack Goldsmith, people from the journalistic world, people from the national security world, including John Brennan, former head of the CIA, Keith Alexander, former head of the NSA, Michael Morrell, former deputy director of the CIA, Avril Haines, who's current national security director, national intelligence director, to write essays, including, of course, Ellen. And we asked them to take on these questions and to offer their opinions. And then at the end, we put together what we call a commission, a group of 7 or 8 of us, including people like Eric Holder, former Attorney General, John Brennan, as I mentioned, former CIA, journalists, and so on, to sit down with Lee and with me and to come up with a report that summarized what we felt both was the essence of the essays and also what the members of the commission thought were reasonable recommendations going forward.
Jeff, why don't you tell us what the court held in the Pentagon Papers case, why it was historic, and what gaps it might have left in current days?
You mean to do that, or Lee?
How about Lee? Right?
Yeah.
Well, so the system set up by Pentagon Papers by that decision and a few other decisions is really quite unique in Western democracies. In Pentagon Papers, the immediate issue before the court was whether, on the urging of the government that publication of classified information would be a threat to national security, whether on that motion by the government and claim the courts should or could issue an injunction against the press not to publish the classified information. And the Supreme Court, in a very quick, very expedited hearing and decision, held that the government had an extremely high burden of justification for any so-called, quote, prior restraint. And an injunction is regarded as a, quote, prior restraint. So is a licensing system. The licensing system is the classic prior restraint, where the government says, before you can publish anything, we have to be able to clear it. And so the Washington Post and the New York Times were free to proceed with publication without facing an injunction, because the government was held by the court, majority of the court, not to have provided that very, very high level of justification. So that decision, can be regarded as very isolated and small. You just can't get an injunction against the press, but because it left open, in one sense, the question whether, if they proceed with publication, the government could then step in with a criminal prosecution, and that might be different from a, quote, prior restraint case. So that's one of the unclear dimensions of Pentagon Papers. Both Jeff and I are of the belief that, given all the other jurisprudence around freedom of speech and press, the government would also bear an incredibly high burden of justification for what's called a subsequent punishment. Then there are other elements here. Should the press have a right of access to information? And the court made it very clear in several cases that there is no special right of access by the public or by the press. That's a little overstated, but that's essentially where it stands, no constitutional right. And then furthermore, leakers, the people who provide the information from within the government to the press, have no First Amendment claim that they can advance. So you have this system, as I said, which is you don't have a right to get the information. The leakers don't have a right to give you the information if you're Ellen. But Ellen can go and ask a government official to provide the information, the classified information. And if you do persuade someone to get that, or, I mean, that's a little tricky there. But if the person does give you the information, you then have a constitutional right, absent very, very serious threats to national security and the society. You have a right to publish it. Both with respect to prior restraints and with respect to subsequent punishments. So that's the system. And the question, as Jeff said, we wanted to analyze is how has that worked? And we think it worked, it's worked well. But has the world changed in ways that now the balance of interests are quite different? And that's an incredibly important and very complex decision to be reached.
Ellen, can I add a couple more facts about the case, which I think add to the context of it and why it was such a dramatic decision? First thing worth noting is that Daniel Ellsberg, who'd been a longstanding employee in the government and once was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War, had become suspicious about its wisdom. And he learned of the existence of the Pentagon Papers, which was a 7,000-page document that Secretary of State McNamara had ordered to be written, but to keep confidential about the history of the Vietnam War prior to the Nixon administration. And Ellsberg decided that too many things had happened to get us into the war and during the war that was secret that the American people needed to know. So he decided he wanted to take the Pentagon Papers and to get them out. And the problem was how to do that. Because there were all these national security restrictions. And so what he would do was to basically sneak out of the Pentagon a relatively small number of pages each day, bring them home and Xerox them, and then sneak them back in again so nobody would know that they'd been taken, and then the next day bring out more pages and Xerox them. And this itself took quite a long time. He then read through the papers and decided to take out of them those portions that he thought would be dangerous to the national security, and then went to the New York Times and said, you guys want to publish this. The Times then took several weeks, I think even maybe a couple of months, reviewing the materials, deciding whether they should publish it or not, and to decide whether they thought there was any serious risk to national security, because they didn't want to do harm, and then started publishing. And it's only when they started publishing it that the government, the administration, learned about this whole thing happening. And they then went into federal court and sought an injunction. One of the arguments that some of the justices made in the case, including Chief Justice Berger, if I recall, was that this is crazy. The government doesn't even know what's in the Pentagon Papers. They haven't read this thing. Nobody was paying any attention to it. All this, they only learned about it a few days. Well, actually, the day after the New York Times started publishing it. And they haven't had time to absorb this and to learn whether it creates a clear and present danger to the country. So at least let's give them some time to figure that out. And the court said, nope, not going to even allow that. If you can't tell us today, prove today, that this creates a clear and present danger of grave harm to the country, you cannot join it. And the New York Times can go ahead and the Washington Post can go ahead and publish it. And to some of the justices, this seemed utterly reckless because the government did not even have a fair amount of time to figure out what the dangers might be from the publication of this. But that showed how extraordinary the court's decision was in this respect. The other thing worth mentioning is that the assumption was that Daniel Ellsberg could be criminally prosecuted for what he did. And indeed, the government did bring criminal charges against him. But the federal judge dismissed the charges when the judge learned that the government had broken into a psychiatrist's office to learn more about Ellsberg, and the judge said that was completely impermissible, and so the charges against him were dismissed. But there was no serious question at the time that he could be put in jail for doing what he did, even though, as Lee said, the New York Times and the Washington Post had the constitutional right to publish it. So that just adds a bit more context to the drama of the moment.
In fact, had his psychiatrist's office not been broken into, it probably would have gone to trial. And today, in fact, we actually are in the midst of a federal prosecution of, Julian Assange, the co-founder of WikiLeaks, and some argue he's not a journalist, but be that as it may, the fact is the sorts of things that WikiLeaks did in putting online a big cache of documents that had been leaked to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning, a former Army private. Those actions are very similar to what journalists do, right? Which is gather information and make it available to the public. Of course, there's some steps we take along the way. Right? We vet the information, we corroborate it, we add context, we try to ascertain that it's genuine, it's truthful. How relevant is it? How newsworthy is it? Not sure that WikiLeaks did all those things, but there are enough similarities between what WikiLeaks did and what journalists do that I think this prosecution of Assange under the Espionage Act gives pause. And I feel it's like it's odd that really, I think this is the first prosecution of a potential journalist, right? Since Ellsberg, is that not right? Why do you think that didn't happen? Why weren't there? Was it just forbearance, Lee or Jeff, either one?
So let me try to put these things together just a bit. I mean, what Jeff said, it's, I think, important to realize that it was in a period of time, about a 15-year period, in which the Supreme Court really set forth the jurisprudence of the First Amendment that we live with today.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a series of remarkable decisions that cohered around this idea of extraordinary protections for speech, extraordinary risks and costs that the society has to bear in return for the benefits of free speech. And part of this was a role of the press as having a quasi-constitutional kind of, fourth branch of government that we all know about. The court never was prepared to say that there are special rights for the press in this incredibly seminal, fertile period of establishing rights. Nevertheless, you do have the feeling that the amazing protections for the press to be able to publish classified information, government secrets, was built around a premise that the press, by that point in American history, had become quite responsible. Now, I'm not prepared to say that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are responsible in the sense that I'm talking about with respect to the journalistic standards of the Washington Post and the New York Times. So the interesting thing is asking if Pentagon Papers was premised on a view of the press as having this very special role to play and as having a degree of self-control and self-responsibility that we could entrust them with these incredible freedoms because of enormous things are at stake. I mean, that's one of the things the national security people in the book claim. I mean, this is not innocent, small stuff. I mean, there's a potential for enormous damage. To what extent has that premise evaporated because of the ability of people like Julian Assange and anybody now to both get classified information and to distribute it to a vast number of people? And that's because, of course, computers and all the data that's available digitally. That's a profound question.
Absolutely. I think one of the themes of your book, Unstated, is times have changed. the technology has changed, the media landscape has diversified and is fractured. The makeup of the court has changed, mores have changed, right? And we're dealing with all of these. And so the traditional gatekeepers in the past and the traditional sort of forbearance of government is not here. So one of the things I guess you were tackling with your book and your essay is just how do we try to deal with the changed and new reality. I guess I asked Jeff to talk a little bit about one of the ideas you might have for how we restore that right balance between protecting national security and the public's right to know.
So one concern that was felt by almost all of the participants in the book, whether they were journalists or First Amendment scholars or people from the national security world, is that there is dramatic overclassification. And it's understandable why the incentives are there to overclassify, because if you're a government employee or a government contractor who is in a position to decide whether to classify or not to classify a particular item of information, if you err in one direction, that is, if you underclassify, then you potentially put the government at risk in a very serious way. If you overclassify, big deal. Almost everything's classified anyway, so what difference does it make? And so one of the realities at present, and this was something that even the government officials from the NSA and from the CIA and so on were very clear about, is that there is a dramatic overclassification today. And part of this was generated by the world after 9/11, where the sense of vulnerability has become much greater than it was in the decades before that. And the problem then is, how do you deal with that, right? So one thing you could do is to say, well, it's okay to leak information, right? If you're a government employee and you come across some information that somebody has erroneously classified in your judgment, then you can just give it to the press, right? Because there's so much overclassification, we should let you do that. Well, there was no sentiment in favor of that approach. The basic notion was that there is grave danger that can occur from the disclosure of properly classified information, and some Tom, Dick, and Harry government employee or private contractor who doesn't really have enough knowledge about the context of information should not be in the position of being allowed to make that decision, even today, and even though recognizing there's vast overclassification. So one of the challenges then is, are there ways to review the classification decisions that have been made? And so one of the suggestions was that a government employee who has a question about whether particular information has been improperly classified, they should be able to go to an organization within the CIA or the NSA or whatever, and present the question as to, is this information improperly classified? And to have some type of a review group that is reasonably disinterested make the judgment as to whether any particular bit of information shouldn't have been classified and therefore should be released. Going beyond that, the recommendation suggests that a government employee who has such questions about particular information should be able to do this anonymously, because they don't want to be seen as troublemakers. They don't want to be seen as people who are putting the nation's security at risk. So there should be a system in place in which government employees or private contractors who have questions about the legitimacy of the classification of particular information should be able anonymously to present that question to a neutral and detached group within the national security world to enable them to make that judgment. And that's a recommendation from the commission. That's not the law today.
No. I just wonder whether, if you have a group made up of national security professionals from inside the CIA or NSA, or even formers who are outside but who come from that world, wouldn't their predisposition or predilection be toward keeping this classified or secret?
Well, the suggestion was to have this review board made up of people who were not just longtime national security officials, but also people who may have been journalists in the past, but have national security clearances, who may have been, yeah, right. But the recommendations recognize that you don't want a bunch of national security fanatics making the decision. You want people who are objective and fair-minded and knowledgeable, and so that's missing right now. And,
Yeah.
and the basic assumption is that somewhere between, I forget the numbers, but 80 and 90% of the classified material should not be classified. And this is the estimate given by people who were leaders of the national security facilities in the world. And the question is there some way to change that?
Yeah, Lee, you were saying something?
So, I mean, Jeff is describing really one of the powerful themes, I think, of the essays, and that is that there are opportunities for self-help by the government, if, you know, greater care in the treatment of security, national security information, and also ways to try to get more public access to that information that could be short of constitutional claims. So there's a lot of focus on how the system works, why it's broken, and why it needs to be repaired. It's very important to, I think, realize that all of these essays coming from people whose lives have been spent in the national security arena, journalists, where you would expect this conclusion, and academic scholars, a broad consensus that Pentagon Papers and the regime set up has worked reasonably well in America. Very hard to make that judgment. You don't know what wasn't released. It's hard to know, and it's hard to know what was released that was damaging, but the government wouldn't say anything because they have an interest in not furthering the damage. Okay, all of that said about, you know, how hard it is to make the judgment, there is a sense that Pentagon Papers should not be changed at this point. That's, I think, the judgment of the book. That's a significant conclusion, because you could say, as Jeff indicated, I mean, this is kind of incoherent. It's crazy. I mean, we should rationalize this system. There should be a way of getting access. There should be strict laws about not publishing classified information. That's the way other countries like Britain have set this up. We allow this incredibly chaotic and somewhat dangerous situation to unfold, and yet the judgment is it's probably worked, and we shouldn't abandon it at this point. But the first time that some really irresponsible person comes in and says, I want the protections of Pentagon Papers extended to anybody in the world who has access to national security illegally, I think we're in pretty grave danger that the whole system may unravel. So, you know, I think everybody's looking at the Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and thinking, is that on one side that it shows the dangers, or is it on the other side that that's a risk we can bear, and for the good of having the press as a check on government?
Well, my reaction to what you just said is that, yes, Pentagon Papers, the system has worked up to this point, but technology has so changed the landscape that, as you point out, I mean, had, you know, the internet and thumb drives existed in the days of Daniel Ellsberg, maybe he would have been able to just take everything out on one thumb drive in, you know, one evening and then put it all out there, but he didn't. So these days, I mean, if someone decides to publish everything without vetting the material first, they could do that. But that really, apart from the big dumps that WikiLeaks has done, since Julian Assange has basically been, you know, detained or in jail, in prison, we haven't seen that. Right? So what So what does that suggest? Does that suggest that maybe the system still does continue to work? And, if there is a small outlet that somewhere puts up some piece of highly classified information, but very few people see it, then perhaps the impact isn't as great as if the New York Times or the Washington Post put something up. So I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
First of all, I think that you're omitting Edward Snowden's leaks from this story. And I know that there are many people who think his leaks were not such a big deal. I actually think, from having been inside the national security world for a short time, that they did a lot more damage than the American press has admitted, because they wanted to defend him. But that he really did do serious damage to national security in a range of ways. And he, of course, in theory, could be prosecuted if he came back, which is why he's not coming back. But I also think that both the Snowden and the Assange type situations create this issue of, as you said, the amount that you can steal in terms of information. What Snowden was able to do was vastly greater than what Ellsberg was able to do. And second, Ellsberg was actually a very professional national security official who was able to make responsible decisions, whether one agreed with him or not, about these matters, whereas Snowden was not. I mean, Snowden had very little actual experience in the national security world. He was a very low-level official compared to Ellsberg, and yet he had access to this enormous amount.
Yes, and in fact, he asked the journalists with whom he shared the information to use their best judgment as to what to withhold, which is in fact what we at the Washington Post did.
Right, but it wasn't limited to the Washington Post.
Correct.
Part of the problems. And again, the other concern that we should have today, which we mentioned earlier, is that, as you said, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal were responsible and are responsible entities in this respect. And as the press, we can reasonably trust them not to be reckless and irresponsible. They may make mistakes, but they're not going to be reckless about it. But in today's world, you don't need them. You simply do not need them, right? If you take a thumb drive and you take all the information you can put in the thumb drive, you can put it online. You can give it to any Tom, Dick, and Harry, and they can put it online. And one of the questions is, should the protection of the press that we give in the New York Times and Sullivan, I'm sorry, in the Pentagon Papers case, be limited to something we call the press as a First Amendment matter, and that the court now be in the business of doing something it has avoided doing up to this point, which is saying that there is an entity called the press, and it doesn't mean that every single human is the press just because they choose to put things up on social media. That's tricky. The court doesn't want to be in the business of defining as a First Amendment matter who is the press and who's not the press. But it may well be that we're moving into a world where we have to make those judgments, that it's important to give a high degree of discretion to those members of the press we trust to make sound decisions, while at the same time not allowing wildly irresponsible people to put out information that is in fact seriously dangerous to national security, and they're not in any position to make these judgments, and they don't care. And so that's one of the questions I think the court at some point is going to have to face. And one way to do that is with legislation, and to see whether the legislation is constitutional. That is, Congress could pass a law that says the Pentagon Papers applies only to the press, and we define the press in this way. And then the court would then have to decide whether that's constitutional. And they'd probably be more willing to do that than to define who the press is themselves, which would be even more awkward for the court to do. But somewhere down the line, that's one of the changes that we may well be pushed into if we want to maintain a responsible balance between national security and the freedom of the press.
And this is one of the things that the commission recommended, that the Espionage Act, which is a very blunt instrument for dealing with espionage and real spying, should be amended to have gradations of penalties, really focus on spying for the criminal actions, and try to recognize a role of the press as having greater legal protections than others. So just what Jeff said is recommended by the. There's another dimension of this, Ellen, which I think is very important, and it goes to the Assange thing. And I don't want to pretend to be an expert in the litigation against Assange, but my understanding is, but it's not important for this case. It's the big issue. One of the questions is, what is the line between a journalist receiving information and then claiming Pentagon Papers protections and actively going in and aiding and abetting, soliciting, actually committing crimes to get the information? And so my understanding is, I could be wrong about this, but that the Assange thing is partly in the reason it's problematic for many people is because it moves into the first category. That is, we're just prosecuting you because you received information, and that's bad. But it's different if the person is prosecuted for, providing whatever assistance is needed, actually trying to get persuading the person to do it, or helping the person to do it. And you know this line very well because this is your business.
Yeah, in fact, the initial set of charges against Assange were for conspiracy to
That's right.
hack, right?
Yeah.
So, and criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and those were seen as less problematic because they didn't involve the Espionage Act and didn't get to sort of the heart of what it is we do as journalists, which is receive information and then publish it, just as you said. And then it was when they added these charges under the Espionage Act that all the concern arose.
Yeah.
So I like what the commission said about amending the Espionage Act. I'm not sure how you do it though to make clear that who's a journalist, who's not. Do you distinguish between someone who just self-publishes a blog and someone who works for the Washington Post?
No, these are hard. These are hard problems. I mean, and we don't pretend to be, the leading experts, but there are many areas where we do protect, quote, the press. I mean, who gets to come to White House briefings? Who gets to have a privilege in state laws that have? Who gets to attend a trial? Or there are many practical ways in which we make this kind of judgment. And again, this very well because your profession depends upon it. And we think that there are ways that you could absorb that into a principled judgment.
I mean, one of the ways to think about this is the analogy to journalist privileges. So the Supreme Court in Brandenburg v. Hayes refused to recognize a First Amendment right of a privilege, like an attorney-client privilege or doctor-patient privilege or priest-penitent privilege, for reporters and sources, and basically said reporters can be compelled to reveal their sources in a legal proceeding. And part of the reason the court didn't want to reject that view was because they would then have had to decide who's a reporter and who's a journalist. And that was, they thought that was just not something they could handle in any principled or predictable manner. But since then, 48 states and the District of Columbia have adopted statutes that determine who gets to assert a statutory journalist privilege and who doesn't. And I don't know how well those things have worked out in practice, but that's a situation where we actually, as a nation, with the exception of 2 states, have adopted that kind of a law and have required a determination as to whether someone's a journalist or not for the purposes of asserting a privilege.
Against having to give up their sources, is that it? The Shield Law you're talking about?
Yeah, right. But the court said there's no First Amendment right not to give up your resources. But 48 states and the District of Columbia have enacted legislation that says journalists do not have to, and those laws define who a journalist is. So not every Tom, Dick, and Harry could just say I'm a journalist. And so they have done that, and it doesn't seem to have caused all that much controversy. So the point of that is simply to say that maybe we can, by statute at least, define who a journalist is for purposes of national security issues.
Do you think we should extend that to there's a sort of an analog or parallel situation where in leak investigations, the government has often sought email and phone records, metadata records, who called whom, what for how long, or who emailed whom, of journalists in order to try to figure out who their sources were. And that tactic has, which has been revealed recently, in fact, in some cases, stories involving the Trump administration, that definitely has a chilling effect, right, on sources. I can attest to that, personally, and which is not healthy, right, either for press freedom or the public's right to know. But should there be in statute, as we know, Attorney General Garland recently said, okay, well, as a matter of policy, we, the Justice Department, will not go after reporters' records in leak investigations. Only, in leak investigations, if there's a situation where someone's life is at risk, or there's a kidnapping, maybe that overrides it. But in leak investigation, generally, we won't. Should that be an actual law? Should that be in statute, do you think?
I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be a statute. But in both the policy by the Department of Justice, or by a statute, or by a constitutional interpretation, you have to define who a journalist is.
Yep.
And that's the awkward point in there. And the other awkward point is, do you want to give the journalist that freedom to protect the identity of a criminal? This is even more complicated than the source situation, because here the source is a criminal. If they're a leaker.
Well, they're a criminal if the information is classified, right? TSS, top secret, or
right, it has to be classified.
beyond,
right.
But if 50 or 90% of it is overclassified, maybe, that raises the question too. If a government official is prosecuted under the Espionage Act, should that person be afforded a public interest defense that, this information should not have been classified? It's actually more, the damage to national security is outweighed by the interest in the public knowing about what the government did in this case, for instance. Maybe there was some abuse of authority that needed to be put out there. What do you think?
Well, I'll say quickly, Jeff is more expert on this than I am. Jamil Jaffer in the book takes this position. And so there's an essay in arguing that there should be this kind of defense for government officials who leak. I think it's Jeff's and my judgment, certainly my judgment, and it's the judgment of the commission that we shouldn't extend a First Amendment protection, public interest defense to leakers. And that's based on the arguments that there are a lot of people. I forget what the number is. Jeff will know. It's like 3 million people, or who have access to classified information. It's expanded exponentially. There are many people not prepared to trust their judgment about what the public needs and not, and what the risks are to the country. They take an oath beforehand in these cases. There are just lots and lots of arguments or lots of reasons to think this is not a group of people that we are prepared to say, go at it, release what you want, and we'll look at it later and make a judgment whether this benefited the country or not. And so we need to we're prepared to live with that rule. That's, again, all part of this incredibly ambiguous kind of system that doesn't, on the face of it, make a lot of sense, and yet seems to have worked again. And so that's how I see it. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, again, this comes back to the recommendation of the commission that government employees who leak classified information should not have a defense, but that there should be mechanisms in place internally to enable them to raise questions about whether particular classified information was properly classified, and to create that process in a way that there's reliable decisions being made by neutral decision makers who will then say, no, this is wrongly classified, the information should be released. And that's what's currently missing. But what, as I said, the people involved in this report, including national security people, like John Brennan and Eric Holder, said this is what we should do in order to correct the current situation. But I agree with Lee that to allow every Tom, Dick, and Harry government employee with a national security clearance, which is not any longer such a big deal, frankly, because there's 3 million of them, including private contractors, to be able to make their own judgments about whether to disclose classified information is, I think, kind of reckless and doesn't really make sense.
And the other thing is the commission recommends that not only that the system internally have more opportunities for people who think the public interest would be served by releasing the information to use those to get it. Also, there are gradations, should be gradations of punishment. You know, that you know, people may have violated the law, but they shouldn't necessarily go to jail for 10 years. Because of which is, you know, the Espionage Act again is incredibly blunt.
Yes. And I know that there also have been some suggestions, such as having someone who, like an Edward Snowden, believes that there's information that should be made public but isn't. They should have alternatives to leaking first. Maybe going to an inspector general or going to Congress. What does your commission say about that, and what do you think of that idea?
That's one of the recommendations that the commission makes. And again, this is supported by people even in the national security world here, who basically say the current situation is not responsible, right? The vast majority of classified information should not be classified. And we have to find a way to address that. Leaks are not the best way to do that, because then you're potentially releasing information that is dangerous to national security. And we don't trust all of these 3 million or whatever individuals with access to classified information to make those judgments for themselves, especially when they don't go now to the New York Times or the Washington Post, but they go to their neighbor who puts it on social media. So the judgment is, how do we correct for the very great overclassification? And I think that the recommendation is to do that by giving government employees who have questions about whether something is overclassified a safe and secure way of raising that question with a responsible entity to make the judgment without putting themselves at risk. It seems to me that that's a very good step to take. And it may not be perfect, but it's a whole lot better than where we are today.
Go ahead, Jeff. Lee. Sorry.
And just for purposes of reflecting the diverse views on the general subject we're talking about, we don't have anybody in the book invited to say what they want. We have these national security people. We don't have anybody in the book saying, you know, why should the press, also not elected, also made up of people who may not necessarily be responsible. I mean, why should we allow them this constitutional right or statutory right to be able to decide what information should go out or not, subject to these very high burdens that the government has to meet? But we don't have anybody saying that, but we do have, I think, a tone, a theme in the essays coming from the national security side or the government side, that the press does overstate its role in providing the public with good information and its capacity to make these judgments, and a little bit of a charge of arrogance on the part of journalists that, you know, somehow they are knighted with this role of informing the public and condemning the national security people for not being concerned about democracy, when in fact the people who are doing this are on the whole really, you know, good people, good public servants.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think if you will, in my essay, I reflected the interesting tension between the journalists and the intelligence community, because in fact one of the great scenes was this scene where my two colleagues, Greg Miller and Bart Gellman, went to the Office of Director of National Intelligence because they had obtained some of the Snowden documents, including the Black Book, all of the classified, highly classified budgets of the intelligence community agencies, and all the the classified numbers about what was being spent on what. And the IC was understandably apoplectic and concerned about what could happen if we were going to publish all this. So Bart and Greg went to the agency, sat down in a room full of analysts from all the different agencies who wanted to see what we had and what we were going to do. And I know some of them had very much that feeling. I expressed this in the essay, that who made you,
Right.
The God to decide who's going to put this out, and why can't we just ask you? Why can't we just order you to give it back? and in fact, the head communications guy, he's terrific, for the then DNI, had to calm everyone down and say, look, of course that's not going to happen. They're going to print. So the best we can do here is to try to understand what it is that they're interested in, why they're doing this, and you express your concerns. And in fact, they had a fairly, I think respectful in the end, two-way process. And throughout that long, involved process of months, really, of the Washington Post dealing with the intelligence agencies on what documents we had and how we were going to do the story, I think a general entente developed in terms of they began to understand and trust that we weren't just willy-nilly putting everything out. In fact, we only published a very minuscule, tiny fraction of the documents we had. And we checked really with the agencies beforehand on the veracity of the documents and what they meant. Because I have to tell you, oftentimes you get a slide from the NSA, it's hard to understand, and it could also be an internal pitch from one of the developers in the NSA trying to sell a powerful new tool. And if you just put that out as saying this is a program and a capability the NSA has without checking, you give a very misleading story. Yeah. So we had to make sure what we had really was what it said.
And Ellen, do you feel confident? Do you feel good looking back on this? I mean, that's what you say in the essay. Do you?
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, we had our hiccups, we had our errors. It was not always smooth sailing, and I know that the intelligence community still would rather we had not published anything at all. But I do think some of the way we report the stories, I think on balance had some public interest and benefit. I do think the big reveal, which was actually done by The Guardian first on the Section 215 bulk metadata program, was perhaps the most impactful, because it not only revealed or exposed this massive bulk data collection program that the government had, but the fact that it was authorized or underpinned by a law, by an interpretation of the law that was problematic, right? Which resulted in Congress, public debate and public eventually changing the law to, I think, a healthier, a better law, and which should have maybe been a public debate from the start. And as from a policy perspective, I think that was a good outcome. I do agree with you and Jeff that there were some, there were other documents that may well have just had, negative and damaged the intelligence community. I know definitely it damaged relationships between, it tarnished the image of the intelligence community, let's say, for a while, which took them years to kind of rebuild and restore. And there was a great deal of mistrust between the tech companies and the government as a result, which again took years to rebuild. Because after all these
do you find, Ellen, that the number of potential leakers has declined with greater government determination to prosecute leakers? Do you think that there is, or other inhibitions on the leaking process?
Okay. Well, if you would look at the 4 years of the Trump administration, some people would say that there were just, like leaks every minute or second. I mean, if you're defining leaks in terms of classified information, I think it goes in waves and ebbs and flows. And when there is a highly public leak investigation, it becomes public that there is a leak investigation, then you feel a chilling effect. You feel clamped down. I've had sources in the past tell me I have to take a poly. I have, a spouse and kids and a mortgage. I can't afford to, lose my job. And so I'd love to talk to you, but I'm afraid, just can't.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had that happen. But then, after a while, things might ease up a little. And then if there's another big leak case, then you sort of feel the tension again.
Yeah.
Can I add one thought about the section 215 point?
Yes.
Because it illustrates another interesting complication here. Because you mentioned that it would have been useful if section 215 could have been discussed to decide whether it was a good policy or not openly. But with section 215, which is a surveillance program, if it's discussed publicly, it's destroyed. So the whole point of keeping it secret is so the enemy does not know you're doing this thing, and you're doing this in a way that enables you to gather information. Now, it may be that it's not very successful, that it's invasive of privacy, and so on. But the point is, you can't really have a public debate about it, because that moots the whole point. If there's a public debate about it, you destroy it.
Yeah, I think Jim Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, once said publicly that he believed in the end maybe it would have been better to have it publicly debated first. But I also wonder, I mean, Title III of the Wiretap Act, right? The Wiretap Law was debated publicly. No, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which lays out the authorities for collection on, agents of a foreign power, foreigners, was publicly debated. So maybe not. I don't know. In the end, I do know that wasn't it the commission you were on, Jeff, that found that the 250, or maybe it was the Privacy Civil Liberties Oversight Board found that.
No, it was us. We found that the 215 was inappropriate and needed to be eliminated.
And actually had very little of any actual value in terms of catching terrorists.
Right. No, it was in fact not a successful program. But again, just to play devil's advocate, the argument on the other side there was that it's a little bit like having a fire alarm in your house. When the batteries go down, you could say, oh, what the hell, we haven't had a fire, we don't need this, why bother changing the batteries? But you change the batteries because you know that this could one day save your life. And so part of the argument on the other side is even if it's a system of gathering information against potential attackers is not being very productive, if once it's productive and it saves a nuclear attack, it's worth having. So that was one of the interesting questions about how do you assess the fact that it hasn't given us any very useful information, knowing that it could give you useful information.
Okay, now I'm going to try to open this up to questions from the audience, and let's see if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll call on you. And I'll also take one right now from chat function. It says, okay, U.S. balancing between free speech, free press versus national security might be not as informational access friendly as it should be, especially from a public interest defense or value perspective. Is there any chance for us to learn from international and or foreign law, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, with recognizing the public defense argument by leakers or media professionals or citizen journalists, like the European Court of Human Rights did nearly 10 years ago? We spoke about it a little while ago, but if it was good enough for the European Court, why not us?
I
don't know enough about how that's worked out to have an opinion, Lee.
Yeah, I mean, I know of it, and but again, I wouldn't want to make a grand judgment about this. Obviously, there's much to be learned by these kinds of analogies and so on. I mean, I do think it's just one of these really interesting judgments, even within this country. Has it worked or not? And the judgment of the book, I think, is it has worked. So.
Okay.
Ellen, can I just jump in for 1 second with a sort of housekeeping announcement,
Yes.
which is if people want to ask questions, if you click on the participants button on your WebEx session, you'll see your name, and then below that you'll see a little icon that looks like a hand. If you click on that, it will raise your virtual hand, and Ellen can call on you, and then we'll unmute you.
Great.
All right. It looks like you have a question now from George Freeman. So if you want,
Okay.
we can take George's question for starters, if Lisa can unmute
Yep.
him.
Okay. Yeah, I have one comment and a question or two. The comment is, I think you were talking at the beginning of the session about why the Times and Ellsberg weren't prosecuted as opposed to the prior restraint case. And obviously, Ellsberg was prosecuted and said that when he got off for prosecutorial misconduct, he said it was the happiest day of his life. The Times wasn't prosecuted, even though I think 3 or 4 justices said that they should be or they could be. And I asked Whitney North Seymour once at I think it was a 25th anniversary Pentagon Papers panel at the Times, why the Times wasn't. And he said, the answer is easy. He said, I'm a litigator. I said, well, that's nice. He said, I'm a litigator and I don't like to lose. And Nixon wanted me to go after the Times. But I said, going after the Times in New York during the unpopular Vietnam War, for Nixon, who was an unpopular president, certainly in New York, it was a loser and I wasn't going to do it. And he made it seem that that was the end of it. So it's kind of an interesting answer. The question I have, and it really goes to Jeff more, is when you were talking about a possible federal shield law, one of the stumbling blocks, as Jeff recognized, was who's a journalist and the definition of a journalist. But I kind of view that as a straw man. I mean, 49 states, not 49 states, because some of it by judicial opinion, but let's say in the 30s, 39 states have shield laws, and they do define journalists. So why? It's not an insurmountable burden to figure out how to write up a definition of a journalist. I mean, there are varying ways of doing it, but it's not. It shouldn't be the reason that there's no federal. It shouldn't be a reason at all why there shouldn't be a federal statute. And it always bothers me that that's given as the reason, because it seems like a straw man, frankly. The other question I simply have of both of you, or all three of you really, is on Assange. I mean, I don't think you've really said, do you strongly support him, or what position do you take on Assange, I guess, for want of a better question?
So on the first question, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the reason I raised the fact that there were so many states with these policies was that it's clearly something you can do, but it's easy to understand why the court doesn't want to do it by defining who a reporter or a journalist is. But why Congress wouldn't do it, you can't defend that on the ground that it's so hard to do, given the fact that 48 states have already done it. The argument in Congress that prevented the law from being enacted was really more about the national security question. That is, the opposition to the law was not, we can't define a journalist. It was much more that given the stakes in the realm of national security, we just don't think we want to go down that road. The states don't have that problem. They're not dealing with national security issues, but the federal government is. And the primary opposition to creating a privilege was the fear that if you did that, it would wind up enabling leaks and encouraging leaks that did real serious damage to the country. So that was, I think, the main reason why Congress didn't do it. I think that they should have done it. It's a shame that they haven't done it. But I think that was the primary objection that was being put, not so much how do you define a journalist, because so many states have satisfied that. No, I don't know how well they've done it, but so far as I'm aware, it hasn't been all that controversial.
What is how do they define a journalist? Is there some template for that? Or?
I looked at that about 10 years ago when I was writing something about it, but I haven't looked at it since then. And I honestly don't remember what I saw then. But there are a lot of different, I mean, there was a lot of similarity, but also a lot of differences. And, imagine if you had to sit down and write a statute that said, this is who a journalist is. you could make it fairly easy, and you could say for national security issues, you could say it only applies to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. You could list, a group of entities that you believe are trustworthy, and just say those are the only ones. And then the question was, would that be constitutional to limit it to only a select group of organizations? That would be problematic. But trying to define it other than by identity, I think gets really hard.
So I'm of the disposition to favor a constitutional sort of regime or right for the press, and to do the work of trying to live with that very, very difficult judgment. I mean, I think we make all kinds of difficult judgments. So, and it would involve elements like, do you publish on a regular basis to inform the public? Have you been part of an institution, or is it an institution that subscribes to journalistic values? I think it's possible to.
What about the Columbia Student Newspaper?
Right. So of course that's the press. I think you can live with that. Jeff doesn't, and this is I think we're sort of on the cusp of that, which goes to the Assange case, because I'm not prepared to say what I think about that specific case. But what my worry is that the more the claim goes to everybody has the Pentagon Papers right, the more likely it is we will no longer have a Pentagon Papers, because we won't be able to live with the risks of people acting irresponsibly. So I believe in Pentagon Papers. I think it's a wonderful system. I think it's an incredible American invention. I think it's filled with all kinds of ambiguities, but it works, etc. And I think we live with we tolerate this vagueness around special protections for the press and not. But the other view, which Jeff can articulate better than I can, is very, very powerful. Everybody should have rights. We shouldn't be selectively deciding who gets certain rights, and the definitional problems are insuperable. The countless hypotheticals can, turn it into a spectacle of, no distinction, no rational distinction. So, but that's a tension in this that I think is extremely powerful.
I don't know if I'm still on, but you guys both were on a call with us at the MLRC about it when the book came out or was about to come out. And you suggested that the criterion ought to be if your work is edited, that was a way of distinguishing Assange from real journalists. And, it seemed like a very interesting, novel idea. Can that be actually worked into a statute? Because I think it's a great idea. I just don't know if it's workable or how one can legislate that. But I kind of liked it. Have you done any more thinking on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's lovely to hear that we had a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
But I think it sort of goes to this idea of, are you practicing journalism, and journalism as something that is striving to uncover the truth and objective, like a scholar. I mean, we know the difference between a scholar and somebody who's an advocate. We make these distinctions all the time. But should you do it as a constitutional matter? So that's it. I wouldn't put it in terms of, are you edited? I think probably the point was made that Assange is somebody who is committed in WikiLeaks, that everything should be out there. I mean, there should be no judgment, and that may be just intolerable for the system. Jeff?
I think, yeah, well, let me I think in some cases, WikiLeaks made the argument that they were a journalistic organization. They did exercise editing functions with some of their videos, like the collateral damage video, I think. And they say they did additional reporting, they wrote text. And so then there's the other point that you could have a person who's a writer, they do their own reporting, and then they have a Substack account and they just self-publish. There's no editor above that person to look at their words before it goes out. Would would they be covered, by this privilege? So
Yeah, I would think one of the most sensible ways of trying to resolve this is to create a privilege for, as I said, a limited number of named entities. If what we're really concerned with is national security leaks being handled in a responsible, reliable way, both in terms of publishing and not publishing, then the world of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, which is what the court was thinking about at the Pentagon Papers case, no longer realistically exists. So why not have a statute that simply identifies 50 different organizations, TV stations or newspapers or magazines, whatever, who are concluded to be, by a consensus of people, responsible, and say they can publish the information and be protected by the Pentagon Papers, but others can't. I don't see why that's not a sensible solution. After all, only a limited number of reporters can go to a press conference, and only a limited number of people from the press can go to a presidential dinner. So why not just say, here's a group that we have decided as Congress is reliable and responsible, and they have the privilege. But every time Dick and Harry doesn't have the privilege because we don't trust them. It's not perfect. I understand the downside, but it seems to me a more sensible system than the one we have at the moment, where basically I can put online a thumb drive that some idiot in the national security private contractor gives me, and it'll be available to everybody. That doesn't make any sense. So that's not the world the Pentagon Papers was imagining.
Yes, I very much like how Jeff is thinking here. And another way to cut this or to add to this is that there is a very important role for institutions. And we think that these institutions that are built around journalistic standards and so on really play this extremely important role. And we're prepared to live with the judgment. Even though they're individuals who may do things that publication that are beneficial to, we're not going to draw lines based upon whether an individual is serving the public good or not, or a journalist or not. Only institutions. Realistically, I think that's what we're working with. I mean, I think that's how we've lived with this. The question is, when you put it specifically as an issue before a court, it becomes problematic to decide it. And yet, that's why at the very end of the book, I think the point is, think about this over time. Not every issue is put precisely before the Supreme Court sharply in this. The court can decide what cases to take, what cases not to take. It can give indications of where its thinking is going. It can test ideas. Constitutional law is not just, give me a hypothetical and I'll decide it. We know that,
I think your answers are lovely, but I wouldn't, if I were you, I wouldn't show up at the bloggers convention. I don't think it'd be very popular there.
I wanted to ask, Jeff, I think you've written about the Burger Court, right? How do you think, if these issues came before the Supreme Court today with the complexion of the court, do you think that we would see different results or different answers than we would have 40, 50 years ago?
It would depend who the president was.
But I mean,
I'm being very cynical here.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, I think if it was Joe Biden, this court would decide the case in a way that was not in Joe Biden's interest. But if it was Donald Trump, they would decide the case in Donald Trump's interest. I hate saying that.
Wow.
I mean, as someone who spent his whole career on constitutional law and on the Supreme Court and teaching about it, but at this point, I am quite cynical about the way in which the majority of justices on this court are going to be deciding cases now. I think they are very much distorted by their own ideologies. I don't think they're aware of it. I don't think they're conscious of it, but I think you can predict it with a pretty high degree of confidence. I did it even a few years ago, before the current court. I did a very casual study. I asked a bunch of common law professors to identify for me the three most important common law decisions over the past 20 years in their judgment. And then I took the 20 that had the most votes and I asked people, how would you think conservative justices on the court, and this is before before any of the Trump nominees, would decide these cases based upon, I'm sorry, how would you think a Republican legislator would vote on these cases? And then that correlated 100% with the way the Republican appointed justices voted in those cases. On the Democratic side, it was a little less so, on the liberal side. But it was so divided in that way. Now, these are the most controversial cases each term, but basically the justices voted almost 100% based upon the president who appointed them. And now it's, if anything, I think it's even worse. So I feel very cynical about the current Supreme Court. It really worries me.
It's a very troubling, disturbing thought. I mean,
Yes.
the whole notion of an impartial court here it seems naive. Yeah. I
Well, it
think
looks like we've got a couple more questions or people with their hands up. Can we go to Lynn Oberlander?
Okay, good. I don't see them. Good.
Hi, I guess I'm not muted. So thank you. This has really been really fascinating. And I am very much looking forward to reading the book, which I have not read, but I have heard terrific things about. I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with the first. I'll just give you one, which is really, Professor Stone, you talked about Snowden particularly, and you suggested that his document leak had really caused some grave national security harm. And I'm curious, I mean, I work closely, I was a lawyer at The Intercept for a couple of years, and I work closely with those documents, and I'm unaware of any grave national security harm that was at least discussed around the reveal. So I'm curious about that. But I also just want to ask, Snowden, to me, one of the untold stories really about Snowden was that he was able to leave with hundreds of thousands of documents, and that the government had no idea what he had taken. And the bigger story was the way the government, to me, was able to deflect their failures of maintaining, if they're highly classified and top secret, maintaining the secrecy of those materials in any way. Now, I think they've gotten a lot better. On the other hand, they've had some massive leaks since Snowden, a massively important, I forget the names of it, but massively, of all of those tools that the national security system uses. And so maybe they haven't gotten as good as they need to, but I do think that we spend too much time worrying about, prosecuting a Snowden who did in fact bring his materials to journalists and ask them to vet them and ask them to go to the government and only to publish the ones that were truly of interest, and not enough wondering about how the government is maintaining its own secrets, frankly. So maybe that's more of a statement, but I'm curious as to whether you have a response to it.
I think it's a good point. I think that the government has not been as effective at preventing leaks as you would think it would be if it was as concerned about the national security. Part of the reason I think they're not as effective is because there's so much overclassification that this is beyond control. And that's one of the reasons why there would be an advantage in reducing the overclassification, because the government could then focus more effectively on preventing leaks of the information that really could be damaging to the national security. But part of the problem is because they classify everything, it's almost impossible to prevent the leaks. In terms of the damage done by Snowden, I think that the press in the United States was not very interested in some of the consequences of Snowden's leaks that didn't affect American citizens, but affected the ability of the government to intercept communications involving foreigners. And there, I think there were aspects of the program that did provide useful information to serve the national security, which were effectively undermined by informing people outside the United States who were our enemies, that we were able to gather information from them through these devices, and they could then change the way they were communicating to avoid that. That, I think, is a factor that was definitely present, but didn't get much attention because it didn't involve the rights of Americans.
I'll just add, Richard Clark has a really wonderful essay in the book about how the government just is extremely ineffective and inefficient in protecting its own secret and needs to clean up its own house. So there's a very strong essay on that. And on the harm of Snowden, I think there's a consensus across the national security people that this was much more serious than people recognize and journalists recognize. Lisa Monaco, I think, states this very strongly. For what it's worth, those people really assert the harm.
I think DNI Clapper mentioned that they had to shut down an entire collection program in Afghanistan as a result. That was the one program that actually helped protect American troops and forces in Afghanistan. We have another question from David Keating.
Yes, hi. Am I on? Okay. I'm a little surprised about all of the discussion that somehow Congress could create a list of approved publications that would have, some sort of special privilege in reporting on this. I just find that totally incompatible with the First Amendment and rather frightening as an idea. And also just forget about the constitutional part of it. It's impractical. There may not even be a Washington Post today if it wasn't for Jeff Bezos, for example. I mean, we don't know. My guess is maybe Charles Koch would have bought it. Who knows? So the idea that a statute would list a number of publications, I think, is just not real. It's a bad idea, setting aside the constitutional issues. If there is to be something at all, perhaps it would be something based on, total revenues from the enterprise or something like that. Even that makes me frankly uncomfortable, because what are the other implications? Then the government could decide, for example, which entities or get access to public records based on approved publications or not. So I was just wondering if you had any other, concerns about this. Just because the states have done something doesn't mean it's a good idea. There are plenty of state laws out there that are totally unconstitutional, and maybe just no one's had the opportunity to say, look, I'm just as much a journalist as, someone else at this poorly funded newspaper that's about ready to go bankrupt. My journalistic standards might even be higher than some of these local news outlets. And, given the Palin trial, I'm not sure, going on based on somebody editing the work is a good standard either.
So I throw that out there as a hypothetical, only because if you imagine that we reach the conclusion, and the we could be Congress, it could be the Supreme Court, whatever, we reach the conclusion that to retain the current jurisprudence is reckless, because now every Tom, Dick, and Harry is the New York Times. And they will, hypothetically, begin making public all sorts of information that really does have serious harm to the national security, and will not be making responsible judgments about that. If that is the reality, then one solution is to simply overrule the Pentagon Papers case and to say that the media doesn't have a defense of clear and present danger. It's too grave. This is just not the right test anymore, because we can't trust them to do this responsibly, given the seriousness of the harm. That would be terrible. The alternative is to leave things as they are, even if there's lots of actual harm to national security being done by people who are able to do this on their computers, and they're not responsible newspapers. So I'm only suggesting that as a middle ground. It's a way to say, okay, the world's imperfect. And if the goal is to have information made public, if the public should have it, why not simply create an entity, in this case, 100 newspapers, that are able to do this? And if you want to make it public, you go to those newspapers and they can make the decision. Again, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying, in a world in which the two alternatives increasingly look stupid, there may be a need for some intermediate approach, which still identifies those entities that we trust to make responsible judgments about national security information.
And I'm saying that as well, with some greater vagueness around who those institutions are, but willing to accept that the system works because we trust certain institutions. And things are vague all over. I mean, clear and present danger is hardly the clearest standard in the world, and grave and irreparable injury these are difficult to define. And there is the practical reality that, who shows up at the White House for press briefings and who gets access to events and newsworthy events and who has access to privilege. We do have a practice that can be reflected here. But, you make the point in a very powerful way, and it makes one uncomfortable, so that it's a really, really hard problem.
Yeah. It makes me uncomfortable. I just also don't see it as workable. And would you want Congress to decide who it is that we should trust to enjoy this privilege? And then also, would Congress then have to amend the law every time a new, BuzzFeed or something shows up? And
Right.
You could appoint a Federal Communications Commission type entity that would, that is required to be bipartisan and so on. That's required to identify who these entities are, who the privileges are held by.
well,
It's not impossible to avoid some of the downsides.
some interesting ideas and fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank both of you, Jeff and Lee, and the First Amendment Salon and the Knight Institute for hosting this session, and all of you in the audience for taking part. I mean, I think we're about out of time, so thank you again. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Let us, on behalf of the Salons and the Knight Institute, thank you, all three of you, for a great panel and a great program. We very much appreciate your being with us tonight, and I want to wish everyone else a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.